I'm going to put in an overall value for the light side of her neck to match the value on her face. Of course, we're going to keep going back into these areas and building them. Remember, we're still on our preliminary round of shading. See how dominant this highlight on her chin seems? And look how subdued it is on my drawing. That's a dead giveaway that our values aren't dark enough yet. I may even have to switch to a B-LED for this. Until those highlights have as much punch as they do in the photo, we need to keep building the values around them. I'm seeing that the shading on this eye needs to be darker. It feels too light on this side of the drawing. See, if I cover this eye up, the left-hand side looks fine, but when I look at them together, it seems light on the right. I'll start by darkening her eyebrow using a 2B lead. That'll help set the tone and value for the area around it. Careful not to lose those highlights in there. At this point, I'm going to draw in the eyelashes to make sure I'm getting her likeness. I'm switching to a B-LED to shade in the cast shadows from the eyelashes on the white part of her eye. See them? Careful not to make them too dark though. It's a distracting shape right in her eye, so if anything, it's best to make them a value lighter. That's another example of the artistic freedoms you get to take for a more aesthetically pleasing drawing. Doing that won't take away from her likeness, it'll just make the image look cleaner. Back to an H-LED to go over the area and smooth out the grain. Again, don't try to draw the texture in this area. Just squint your eyes and guess the average value and shade in a flat tone. If you wanted to put in a texture for the pores on her skin, I would suggest going back in with your sharpened eraser and removing tiny spots of shading at the end, like adding detail. But I don't think it would look good in this portrait. Don't put in too much information in her ear, and the edges should be soft, like it's out of focus. You want viewers focusing on the detail you did on her face, not off looking at her ears on the sides of your drawing. The shading under her eyebrow could get a bit darker. I'll jump down to the lips next. I'm building up the value with a B-lead. You could use a 2B for this as well. I just want to keep the grain as small as possible. Notice the highlight is actually second value, so use your H-lead to lightly shade over it. You don't have to get every crack, but draw in a couple lines to indicate a texture. The shape of this shadow under her lips needs to be extended about this far, and needs to be darker, so I'll switch to a 2B. Now that the value on her lips is in, I can see that the shadow side of her face needs to be a value darker as well. That already looks better. I'm using a 2B for this and going over the shading I did with the B-lead. Of course, it's not ideal to work over harder leads with softer leads, but it's often unavoidable. And going up from a B to a 2B is so incremental, it won't be a problem. What you want to avoid doing is big leaps, like shading over an H-lead with a 3B. And I think the shadow cast by her nose needs to be a bit darker overall. Don't forget to keep the value on her neck caught up. You don't have to do her whole neck right now, but make sure you at least transition the area where they meet. Once the shadow side of her face is brought up to a more accurate value, you're going to notice that the light area you gave a preliminary value to earlier needs to get darker as well. So go over it again using an H or B lead depending on your pressure control. The light shading on her chin should also come up about a half a value. Work on the area until the highlight stands out more. There's a short gradient on her jawline that plays an important role in making that curve look soft and rounded. I'm going to switch to a B lead to work that in. Now I'll switch to an H lead to put in some of these subtle value changes on the planes of her chin. I'm shading so lightly right now that it's barely even changing the value of the area. I just want the grain and texture of the hatching to be smoother. I'll just erase more of these access lines, and I think the shading on her forehead needs to be darker as well. I'm going to move to a B lead because the H lead just wasn't dark enough. Again, I know that's breaking my rule, but as I said, going from an H to a B is such an incremental difference in pencil lead hardness that it won't make a noticeable difference. That looks much better, and even though it's only come up about one value, look how much more evident the highlights are. Take a moment to step back from your drawing and see if anything stands out that needs adjusting. I see a few gradients that could be smoother. I'll work on the light side of her neck with an H lead. I'm changing the angle I'm sitting at so I can comfortably put in another set of hatching without going in the same direction. Her shoulder actually gets pretty dark, so I'll switch to a 2B lead. As a matter of fact, her entire neck can get darker. And that's a piece of tape in the corner holding the paper down so I can't go any further. Next, I'm going to bring up the value on the right side of her nose. That's really helping. Her nose looked pinched before.